látni szavakat, nehéz nekem olvasni, mert nem mentem iskolába Magyarországon, de látni azokat szavakat valamit a szívembe tesz. Mert az anyám, apám mindig Amerikába hívta ezt a helyet otthont. És mindig beszéltek otthonról, és nem akartak soha visszajönni. De mindig a szívükbe ez volt otthon. Kazinc utcán, 910. És most nem bírom látni, hogy nagyon sík, ami nehéz elhinni. Nem fogok beszélni magyarul, mert magyarul bírok beszélni, mint egy 7 éves. Nem tudom a szavakat, amit kell használni ma este. De amikor beszélek egy amerikai, meg kell magyarázni, hogy mit jelent lenni egy európai, aki élt a 20. században. Nektek nem kell azt megmagyarázni. Amikor kisgyerek voltam, 56-ban Amerikában, láttuk az orosz tankokat a Kácfa utcán, ahol az nagynéném élt. Mi értettük, hogy mit jelent háború Európában. És arról szeretnék beszélni máma, hogy lehet még egyszer, ami volt. És sajnosan azt akarom megmagyarázni, hogy igazán lehet. És a veszély igaz. And I will now stop butchering the Hungarian language. And try to speak to this book. This book tries to raise this question. For 500 years, Europe dominated the world. This was a terrible event. It was a magnificent event. Because until the Europeans came, the Mongols did not know the Japanese did not know the Aztecs did not know the English. With blood on its hands, Europe created humanity, a single entity that knew itself, that understood that there was only one humanity, however deformed and harmed it was. Europe did not only create humanity and conquer the world, it also conquered nature. I think always of a night in 1900 in a concert hall where someone could come to it who lived 20 miles away by train, where outside it was winter, inside it was warm, and Mozart played. And in any culture that has Mozart, much is forgiven. But there was one truth about Europe throughout this entire period. It could never conquer itself. As far as it went in conquering nature, as far as it went in conquering the world, it was constantly in a state of civil war against itself. The Spaniards failed, the Dutch, the French, the British, the Germans. For 500 years, there was a constant civil war. Yet at the same time, there was nothing as magnificent as European culture. I look back on it and I envy it from this standpoint even. And yet, in 1914, someone wrote a book. His name was Norman Angell. It was called The Great Illusion. He was English. He won the Nobel Prize later. And he demonstrated categorically that it was impossible for there to be another war in Europe, because the interdependence in terms of investment, trade, and everything else made war impossible. He wrote the book in 1910. Obviously, he was wrong, because what he didn't understand, in this case, he was a brilliant man, was that interdependence increases the likelihood of war, not decreases it. Madagascar will never go to war with Brazil. They have no issues, no contact, no relationship. But France and Germany went to war 3 times, precisely because they were interdependent, precisely because each side feared the other would take advantage of them, that each side would shift the relationship, that each side wanted to control what went on. Interdependence is a term we use to mean the end of conflict. But as we saw in 1914, it was the beginning of 31 years of some of the greatest horror that the human race has seen. About 500 million people died between 1914 and 1945 from political causes. I don't simply mean the First and the Second World War. I mean the Russian Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, the planned famines in the Ukraine, and on and on and on. The number is staggering. And when the war ended in 1945, Europe itself was occupied territory. One part was occupied by the Soviets, one part by the Americans. The Soviets ruled differently than the Americans, but make no mistake, what happened in Europe was not decided in Rome, Berlin, Paris, or London. It was decided during this time in Washington and Moscow. In fact, the question of war and peace, the most fundamental question of sovereignty, was not decided in European capitals. That was decided by the Russians and the Americans in Washington and Moscow. And fortunately, they refrained. Europe was peaceful because the Cold War was the ultimate frozen conflict. And no one could move, and nothing did move. Then in 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed, and 2 things happened. The United States emerged as the world's only superpower. It emerged as the imperial force of the world. It did not know what to do with this power. In a very real sense, it didn't want this power. But history takes very little note of what is wanted. By definition, the United States held this role. So when we speak of the American century, it was not the 20th century, because in the first half we were a minor power. In the second half we were caught in a bloody fight with the Soviets that in retrospect we all know we won, but I was there. It didn't look good at various points. The second thing that happened is that Europe regained its sovereignty. And it created a single entity, the European Union. Maastricht was implemented in that year. And the mature form was created to avoid any further conflicts. Its assumption was that if there was economic integration, political stability would be achieved. It was not an unreasonable assumption. And from 1992 to 2008, it was an assumption that was very true. Then in 2008, in 7 weeks, the world changed. On August 8th, 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia. Or from the Russian point of view, Georgia invaded Russia. I don't know. Russia invaded Georgia and declared its return to history. The fundamental assumption that had been made at the end of the Cold War, that Russia was no longer an aggressive factor in the way the world worked, that proved false. And the invasion of Georgia had less to do with Georgia than with the Ukraine, where the Orange Revolution had been staged. And the message was simply this: the Americans were not in a position to support its ally, Georgia. And the Russian message was, this is what American guarantees are worth. This is a friend of America. We invaded, and the Americans did nothing. That happened at the beginning of August. It did not transform the world, but it was the beginning of a fundamental change in the world. The second thing that happened 7 weeks later was that Lehman Brothers collapsed. And with Lehman Brothers collapsing, a financial market crisis occurred. And it was the first financial crisis that the EU ever faced. There were three others that the United States faced since World War II. Municipal bonds, the Third World Debt Crisis, savings and loans. This was not an unknown event for the Americans. But the Europeans were facing their first financial crisis. The first stage was a banking crisis based around the fact that they had bought American derivatives that had collapsed. The Europeans always blame Americans for that, but we might point out that you bought them. But that wasn't the point. Where the US was moving to solve the banking crisis, in Europe, the banking crisis turned into a sovereign debt crisis. It turned into a sovereign debt crisis because the European structure was fundamentally irrational. At the heart of Europe is the world's fourth largest economy, which exports, at this point, about 53% of its GDP. To put it differently, it has an economy so large and efficient that its own population can consume only half of it. The other half has to be exported. And what we learned in 2008 from the Chinese is a great exporting power is only as great as its customers. The Germans wanted the European Union structured in a certain way because it needed a free trade zone where half of its production went. To achieve that, it firstly needed a free trade zone, which the European Union gave it. It secondly had a currency that could be priced in such a way that it maximized German interests of avoiding inflation and at the same time maximizing exports. And third, the rules of Brussels created incredible complexities on top of 26 different tax codes, which made entrepreneurial activity enormously difficult. There was no Facebook, no Microsoft, no Apple challenging Siemens. This was not because the periphery of Europe was not both low wage and creative. Hungarian programmers are known for their prowess. But the structural requirements for entrepreneurial activity weren't there, which meant that the economic development of the periphery was undermined by a range of things that were necessary for not just the Germans, but the Northern Europeans in general. This meant that this region went into recession faster than Germany, and very quickly wound up with a tax base being insufficient to support its debt. Now, the Germans say the Greeks borrow too much, to which the Greeks answered, Deutsche Bank was urging us to borrow in 2009, 2010, 2011, because they needed to maintain demand from the periphery. Each side has a story of what happened. But what happened was, not just in Greece, not just in these other countries, Spain, southern Italy, the unemployment rate surged to 25, 26, 28%. This is the same level, if you look at Southern Europe, this is the same level that the United States achieved during the Great Depression of the 1930s. These are the numbers that existed in Germany in the 1920s. These are extraordinary numbers, and they tell the story of human catastrophe. When we speak about government workers being laid off in Southern Europe, we're not talking about minor figures, we're talking about doctors and engineers and a range of people. And when you're 45 and you're let go from your job and you're a professional, well, you say, all right, this is painful, I have some savings and it will get better. And you will have not just hope, but expectations. And this is the core crisis of Southern Europe and much of the Northern Europe, which is that it's been 7 years since this crisis occurred. It's been 7 years, and it has not been solved. And the Financial Times, which I love reading, it's the great myth maker, announces the Spanish economy is growing extremely fast, faster than the rest of Europe, 1.5%. And unemployment has gone down 0.2%. Well, there are many layers to this story, and I've written about them, but I'm not going to go through them. But the divergence of the interest of three Europes is very clear. Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic live in one reality. Southern Europe lives in a completely different reality. It means something utterly different to be a Southern Italian than to be a German living in Frankfurt. This is not to say the Germans are evil, nor that the Italians are good. It is simply to observe a political phenomenon, the untenability of the European Union as it is now constructed. And of course, the third part, our part, your part, lives looking eastward, wondering what lies across the mountains and what comes next. And to their rear, the Germans have much more important things to do than to wage a war against the Russians, reasonably. The Southern Europeans would like to find their next meal. They haven't any sense. And so now we have three different sensibilities of what Europe consists of. And in each of these countries, the problem is handled in a different way. And my argument is that, and I've written that the decision by Orban to handle the mortgage debt crisis the way he did represents the type of solution that will be imposed on Europe from the debtors. What he basically said is, first, I'm the Prime Minister of Hungary, not a minister of the EU. My citizens cannot pay back the mortgages at the prices that the forint has reached, and I don't want them to lose their houses. So, as a country, we make the following offer. We will pay you back in forints, we'll pay you back this amount, or we won't pay you anything. Think about it, give me a call in the morning, and let me know what you have in mind. Orban's actions resonated because they happened about the same time as the Cyprus disaster. In Cyprus, with German pressure, bank accounts were seized of everybody over 100,000 euros. Now, that's a lot of money, but if it's your retirement money that you saved up and went to Cyprus to retire, as many English did, of course, the explanation, this is all Russian money. There's a lot of Russian money there, but it wasn't all Russian money. So on the one hand, there was Cyprus, where we were visiting at the time, that created a social catastrophe. On the other hand, there was Orban, who basically understood something that many in the periphery don't understand, which is when you owe $1 billion, you're in charge. When you owe $100, somebody else is in charge. This, by the way, is a lesson that Syriza has watched very carefully. But what is really happening in Europe that's even more important is the return of nationalism. Nationalism not only in the sense of radical right-wing parties, or left-wing parties, whatever, but nationalism in the sense that the French, when the president of France, Hollande, speaks to the prime minister of Germany, it is not two European leaders talking. It is the president of France speaking to the chancellor of Germany and representing the interests of his country. And if he doesn't do that, he will lose the next election. Those leaders of Europe who saw themselves as part of a ministerial group working together with other leaders to stabilize Europe are systematically being voted out of office. And the new radical parties that are emerging have many characteristics that are unpleasant, but are saying one simple thing: Europe isn't working. There is an argument that could be had that it can be made to work. My answer is, then do so. It's been 7 years, and it's really time that you solve the problem. The problem here isn't that we haven't really thought of the problem. The problem isn't that there's a think tank in Brussels that's about to prepare a paper. The problem is the extraordinary discovery that Germany and Greece are different. That somehow in the enthusiasm to create the European Union, to create a single currency, to extend it, we forgot the extraordinary diversity of Europe. The condition of Greece cannot sustain a currency priced as it was. A country like Germany cannot sustain a currency that was priced for Greece. The idea that a single currency could exist, whose price was fixed for all countries, but whose taxes varied wildly from everywhere, because that was in the hands of federal governments, this was irrational. In the midst of all this, in the midst of all of this weakness of Europe, it was inevitable that the Russians, who had reemerged, would become active, shall we say. Now, what happened in Kiev is a long story. Did the Americans give money to the demonstrators? Absolutely. They did it very openly. Putin's charge that this was engineered by the Americans has the truth that the Americans had a hand in it. But the Americans could not create a revolution just with some money. It took real unhappiness in the Ukraine. It is striking to me how in this region the Russians are regarded as 15 feet tall. When in fact, when you look at the Ukraine, the Russians bungled the entire operation. Why they had to do it is very clear. That line represents the base of the European peninsula. To the west of it is the peninsula, surrounded by water on all sides. To the east is the Russian mainland. The Baltics are now part of NATO. St. Petersburg, that had been 1,100 miles away from NATO, is now 100 miles away. Belarus is Belarus, what can I say? Ukraine, this is the place where the Russians destroyed the Wehrmacht. This is where they ground them into dust. This is the buffer that guarantees their security. They can no longer let go of this than America can give Texas back to Mexico. It isn't going to happen. Nor can they take it back. The performance of the FSB in Kiev was pathetic. They failed to forecast the rising. They failed to manage it. Their vaunted dossiers on everybody, either they lost or it was 20 years old, who knows. They tried an uprising in the east, it didn't come. And then they sent troops. We sent troops, everybody sent troops. But in the end, the Russians were fought to a standstill. This is important to bear in mind, and because in this region, if you say KGB or FSB, you think of a mythical, impregnable machine. It didn't do so well here, as well as in other places. From the American point of view, there has been a 100-year strategy from 1914. The United States steps into Europe whenever there is the danger of a single hegemon taking control, be it Germany, be it Russia. In the First World War, after the Tsar fell, we sent 1 million troops to France. In the Second World War, we invaded Europe in 1944. Everything else was preface. At the last moment, and participated in the destruction of Germany. In the Cold War, we had learned that coming in late costs us more than coming in early. And so in the Cold War, we confronted them again. But it was the same war. It was a war over Russia's relation to Germany, over and over and over again. The relationship between these two, and the Cold War was simply about that. When the Russians became active in Ukraine, whether successfully or unsuccessfully, didn't matter. The United States would respond. The response was measured. It was not sudden airstrikes or anything like that. We saved that for places we can't do anything in, like Iraq. It was pre-deploying equipment, which is now happening, that has actually been happening for a while, in Poland, in Romania, and the Baltics. Joseph Pilsudski, who was the founder of modern Poland, had an idea called the Intermarium, an alliance that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It never happened between the wars. It is happening now. The relationship between Poland and Romania and the United States is real and it's deep. I don't think there will be a war. I don't know that the Russians can return to Ukraine, but I do know that there is a line being drawn on the second tier of the buffer zone, of the borderland. Now, the question is, what is Hungary going to do? The Hungarians very carefully assumed that the Russians were near, the Europeans were in chaos, and the Americans wouldn't come. This is the assumption I would have made had I been your prime minister. The Russians aren't near, the Americans are coming, and Europe is still in chaos. And the chaos that is Europe economically turns into chaos in NATO. A military alliance consists of militaries. NATO consists of countries, many of whom have no effective militaries, but still like to go to cocktail parties in Brussels. It's very pleasant. The point is that the United States is now entering into bilateral relations. It is doing what is historically done in Europe, slowly developing a defensive position. The Russians are sitting wondering what they can do and making all sorts of threats and promises, when in fact the price of oil is destroying them. This region is always the borderland. And this region is always the first to feel the winds from either direction. And the argument that I'm making is that nationalism is returning to all of Europe. The Spaniards pursue Spanish interests. Even the Scottish now want to pursue their interests. The Catalonians want to pursue their interest. It is not simply that countries are pursuing their interests, regions within countries. This is the Europe that you live in now. When I speak to Europeans, they're all waiting to go back to normal. The period of 1992 to 2008 was abnormal. It was wonderful. It was an extraordinary period. but it was not a normal period for Europe. The Europeans believed they could extend it indefinitely, but they failed to do so. The two great European institutions, European Union, NATO, are in shambles. The Russians are weak, but always remember that a weak Russia is perhaps the most dangerous of all Russias. To defend yourself is the beginning of all national security. Hungary is a small country. It must be in an alliance. That alliance is forming, and I'm very confident, I would like to think, that you will join us. I know that it was an extraordinary thing for me. My daughter, who was an intelligence officer with the US Army, was based at Tuzla in the Balkans. And so when she got her 2 weeks leave, she came to Budapest. And they put her up at a hotel that I happen to know used to be for Soviet officers. This was when I knew that the Cold War was over and we had won. And I also said, come home now, because Tuzla is still a very dangerous place and this is still Europe. And this is the message of my book. For all that we've heard and all we've said, and all the greatness that is Europe, it is still Europe. And no magical transformation has taken place. And we can see it unfolding day after day. Let me stop here and ask for questions.
George, thank you very much. Yes, some question we are collecting. For example, you speak about the borderline countries. What about the regional powers? For example, the Central Asian countries and Central American countries. And the other question is the EU and USA, the trade. How will you see for the future, and which years will be realized? And of course, you speak about is the border, so it's the perspective about the Hungary view for the next decades.
Well, first about trade. The United States exports, in terms of goods, about 9% of its GDP. 40% of that goes to Mexico and Canada, our NAFTA partners, which means that about 5% of our GDP is derived from exports. Now, if we lost half of that, that would be a pity, but it wouldn't transform the American interest. Europe, on the other hand, is both internally and externally a massive exporter, particularly Germany. One of the strengths of the United States is that, unlike China, who was very badly hurt in 2008 when its customers couldn't buy, and Germany, who had to transfigure the European Union to maintain demand, even though by now it's down to zero growth, okay? The United States could recover because it had a substantial internal market between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, about 450 million people. And we do not have that dependency on international trade, which is why you saw the US Congress vote down Obama's desire to have a free trade treaty with Asia, because the view of many in the United States was a free trade zone would suit the exporting countries, South Korea, Japan, China, but we're not an exporting country. And we've had a large debate on this. There are many countries in the world that are regional powers. China, for example, is always cited as a regional power, but geographically, there's very little it can do. To the south is the Himalayas and jungles and mountains. To the north is Siberia. And to the west is thousands of miles of grasslands, which sending forces across would be very difficult. It is now just about to launch an aircraft carrier. It has been just about to launch an aircraft carrier for 5 years. In the meantime, the United States has 13 carrier battle groups. I'm less concerned about Chinese carriers than about Chinese admirals. They have no tradition of naval power, who will train the commanders of the carrier battle groups. China will eventually emerge as a serious power, but not immediately. And this is the reality in a good part of the world, which is that even the regional powers, should the United States wish to involve itself, would be in a very difficult position. Here I want to distinguish between our ability to destroy armies and occupy countries. We are very good at destroying armies. If you have an army you don't want, let us know. We will enjoy blowing it up. Occupying countries, we don't know how to do. That was true in Vietnam. We call it counterinsurgency. What we really mean is occupy it. This is something the British can teach us because they never occupied India. They kind of manipulated the situation. But then what I want to emphasize to you is that the United States is one of the youngest imperial powers you can imagine. It's not even been a generation. I compare the United States to a 15-year-old. If you've ever had a 15-year-old, you know what it's like. In the morning, I don't need you to drive me to work. I'll drive myself to school. I'll drive myself. I can drive. In the afternoon, they come home and their best friend doesn't like them anymore and they're suicidal. This is the United States. The United States swings with manic depressive intensity from one pole to the other. We are completely unused to the power we have. Rand Paul wants to give the power away to somebody. Can't find anybody to take it, but he wants to give it away. We don't want, we weren't expecting, but we are. It will take another generation for the Americans to reach a stable, distant, prudent foreign policy. In the meantime, we've all you got. So when the Russians behave the way they do, it's not going to be a calm, quiet Britain 50 years into its empire. It's going to be us. I like being an American because I live in a world where I don't have to be you. Because the United States is an unpredictable, complex, and sometimes dangerous power. The collapse of the Soviet Union stunned us. We never expected it. We kept flying B-52s 2 years afterwards, uncertain that it was over. But it is the world you live in, so you live in two paradoxes: the fragmentation of Europe and the immaturity of the United States as a power. Is that it? Bye.